have your textbooks with you, I'd like you to go to page 58 in your textbook. Page 58 in your textbook. At the bottom of page 58, figures 10.2 and 10.3, you have two final entries in one of these patronage contests. The rules of this particular contest held that the final entries had to produce two actual physical works to be judged by a panel of judges. On the left, you see a panel, both in your textbook and on the screen. You see a panel by a man named Brunelleschi, and you see Brunelleschi's name in the caption there. On the right, you see a panel by a man named Ghiberti, and you see Ghiberti's name in the caption there. These panels are the same physical size. They're the same physical height, width, and depth. They're made out of the same material. They tell the same story. Traditionally, the story is called the Sacrifice of Isaac. If you're not familiar with the story, Isaac isn't going to be sacrificed. That's what the angel's doing there. They have the same number of characters, an angel, a horse, the same number of servants, the same moment in the story, and so on. It's all set by the contest. So on one side, on the left side, we have Brunelleschi's entry over here, and Ghiberti's entry over here. It's a contest, and usually in a contest, some people like one and some people like the other, but there's always a winner. And as it turns out, Ghiberti wins the contest. This panel over here on the right-hand side wins the contest. Some people like Brunelleschi's panel, some people like Ghiberti's panel, but it doesn't matter. The contest is over, the vote's in, and Ghiberti wins. Once we know that Ghiberti wins, that this panel wins the contest, we can come back to this panel and see some reasons why Brunelleschi has some problems. For one thing, Brunelleschi breaks like rule number 1 of kindergarten art. What's rule number 1 of kindergarten art? Stay inside the lines, don't go outside the lines. Stay inside the lines, don't go outside the lines. Brunelleschi, you see, has trouble fitting everything into the space that the contest allows him. You see some servants kind of slopping over the sides of the panel. Ghiberti makes much better use of his space here. Ghiberti's using a technique which does two things for him. First of all, it frees up space, and it helps to create more of a sense of physical depth than there actually is. In other words, more of a sense of perspective than there actually is. It's a technique called foreshortening. I'm going to give you an example of foreshortening up on the board here. Let's just say that I gave you a homework assignment. I'm not going to, but let's just say that I did. That I gave you a homework assignment. And I said, I want you to go out into the parking lot. I want you to find a car that you like and draw a picture of the car and bring it back into class on Thursday. Now, I'm not going to give you that assignment. Let's just say that I did. I know what would happen. I can pretty much tell you exactly what's going to happen. Because I've been in the business for a while. And I know how students do things, and I know how teachers do things, and, well, I can tell you what would happen. If I told you, go out in the parking lot, find the car that you like, draw a picture of it, and bring it back to class on Thursday. Well, let's see, in a class this size, 8 of you would forget to do it. About 10 of you would just go out in the parking lot and go to the first car you came to and said, okay, I like that car, and draw that car. Because I know some things about students, you know. I've been so silly as to hand out lists of people's names and, you know, have sign up for somebody you're really interested in finding out about, to write a paper about. And, you know, first name on the list, or whatever name looks shorter. You know, that's usually a good, you know, probably that person didn't do very much, so I'll write about that person. But the rest of you would take the assignment seriously, and you'd go out into the parking lot and you would walk around a little bit and you say, hey, that's a pretty nice car. And you would draw something that looks like this. Only yours would be much better, I know. I know yours would be better. But you draw something that looks kind of like that. Only yours would be better. You'd go maybe about 12 feet off the passenger side door, let's just say, and draw that. Now, why do I know that you would draw that? Because that's the easiest way to draw a car. And teachers and students have been playing this game for hundreds of years. Teachers give assignments, students figure out the easiest way to accomplish the assignment. Some students will take 5 or 6 hours trying to figure out how to make the assignment easier and then do the assignment in 30 minutes. Spend more time figuring out how to make it easier. That's fair. That's how the game gets played. Everybody knows that. Okay, that's fair. But what if I gave you a different assignment? And I said, I want you to go out in the parking lot, find the car that you like, stand about 12 feet off the passenger side rear bumper, and draw what you see. That'd be more difficult because you would be foreshortening the car. That's what the technique is, foreshortening. Foreshortening means presenting a long object at an angle. Presenting a long object at an angle. In other words, instead of presenting that long object of the car in a straight side-on shot, you're presenting the car at an angle. In other words, you're foreshortening the car. Presenting the long object at an angle. That foreshortening may show up most quickly if we look at first of all, if we wait for the projector to warm up. That foreshortening may show up most clearly if we start with the angels in the 2 panels. Take a look at Brunelleschi's angel. Brunelleschi's angel is presented to you kind of like I drew the car on the board, that straight side-on shot. Ghiberti's angel over here is foreshortened. That long body of the angel is turned and presented at an angle. That does 2 things. First of all, it frees up space to use for other stuff, and then it creates more of a sense of perspective there. It's almost like the angel is shooting out of the panel at you. Compare the 2 horses. Brunelleschi's horse, the left-hand side. Again, that horse is presented to you kind of like I drew the car on the board, just that straight side-on shot. Ghiberti's horse has the forequarters turned, looking out at you, foreshortening that horse and twisting the front part of the horse's body around and presenting it at an angle. Take a look at Abraham's arm. Brunelleschi's arm in this panel here, a straight side-on shot. Ghiberti's Abraham has the arm kicked back again, presenting that arm at an angle to the viewer. Well, for all these reasons and for several others, Ghiberti wins the contest and gets the contract to design and build what you'll see on the next page, page 59 in your textbook. Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, they're called. The Gates of Paradise, that's a name that Michelangelo gives them. We'll be talking about Michelangelo on Thursday of this week. Michelangelo's Gates of Paradise. First, a little bit about the contest, and then I'll try to communicate to you why these doors are a bit more impressive than this little photograph would indicate to you. It's kind of an interesting contest. Brunelleschi, who loses the contest, is a sore loser. He says, well, if you don't like my sculpting, I'll go do something else. And he becomes an architect. If you're interested in architecture, civil engineering, building construction, that kind of thing, if you're interested in that kind of thing, then you have to know more about Brunelleschi than the rest of us do. You really do. He's a big name in architecture and building construction and civil engineering, and if you're interested, then you have to know more about Brunelleschi than the rest of us do. His major accomplishment is the dome on Florence Cathedral. You see a photograph of that dome on page 58 in your textbook, figure 10.1. That dome is actually larger than it physically can be. There's a number of engineering tricks to be able to fit that dome onto the cathedral. It's an interesting story. Brunelleschi even uses that opportunity to take a dig at Ghiberti. It's kind of a little petty thing. But if you're interested, then you need to know more about Brunelleschi than the rest of us do. Ghiberti is a sore winner. He wins the contest to design and build these doors, but he doesn't quite understand how much time it's going to take to complete the contract. When you go to Florence and you look at the Gates of Paradise, you're really looking at one man's life work, because it's going to take Ghiberti nearly 50 years to finish the project. Now there's more to the project than just what you see on the screen. You're looking at a set of double doors. The two doors are hinged at the side, they meet in the middle. Each of those doors has 5 major panels and all the minor trim work around it. If you open up those doors, it's the same it's the same pattern on the inside. You have 5 major panels on each of those doors, different panels but the same design. And then there are 3 sets of doors. If I do the math right, that's 60 major panels. It takes Ghiberti about 8 months, 9 months to make each panel to the specifications of the contract and to his own personal quality control. And all the framework and the trim work. Well, it works out to about 50 years to complete the project. He takes on students as he's completing the work to teach them how to do this kind of work, and that's how he supports himself in in completing the contract that he signs and honoring his commitment to the project. In your textbook, you have some detail from the doors. I've got several photographs here of the various doors. This one here has been fenced off to protect it. Here's another panel, different from what you have in your textbook, just to see the kind of work that goes into making the bronze panels here. Now, as to why these doors are more impressive than the little photograph would indicate to you, just the doors now, not even the whole photograph, but just the doors are 18 feet tall. That's taller than the ceiling in this room by a couple of feet at least. You have to imagine these bronze doors rising way up above your head. I've got a photograph, I think the next one, of some people standing right in front of the doors with those doors kind of rising up above the head. You see why Michelangelo calls them the gates of paradise, these massive bronze paneled doors. The gates of paradise are symbols of the city of Florence, kind of like the Eiffel Tower is a symbol of Paris, or the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of New York City, and so on. If you're watching a movie and you see a reference to these doors, then you're just supposed to know that you're in Florence. A lot of spy movies are still set in Florence because there's still a lot of mystique and intrigue about the Medici family and that kind of thing. Well, here we have a good start to the early Renaissance. Ghiberti, a big name, a famous landmark in Florence, and some vocabulary we're making use out of. If you go with me one turn of the page to page 60 in your textbooks, figure 10.7 on page 60, figure 10.7 on page 60. Another big name for the early Renaissance, Masaccio, and Masaccio's Tributes Money. It's a fresco painting. You remember what a fresco is from last week. A fresco is a painting where the painting is based in wet plaster painted directly onto the wall. It's kind of an interesting painting in that it tells the same story in 3 different parts of the painting. You kind of move around the painting to get to the story. It's a story that comes out, it's a story about Jesus. It's a story that comes out of the Gospels. It comes out of one of the Synoptic Gospels. It's unique to Matthew. You know what that means by now. It's a story that we find in Matthew, but not the other 2 synoptics. I'll tell you the story so you can keep track of how the story moves around the wall here. The story starts off in the middle of the painting. There we see Jesus. He's a figure with a reddish shirt and a blue robe. There are fancier words for the costuming, but those will work for us. Jesus is talking to a man. He's pointing his finger right at the chest of the man that he's talking to. That man has gray hair and a gray beard, a blue shirt, and an orange robe. That's Jesus' disciple, Peter. According to tradition, Peter is the oldest of the disciples, so he's almost always portrayed with gray hair and a gray beard. And those are the traditional colors for Peter in Western painting, a blue shirt and an orange robe. Fairly early in the story of Western painting, painters agreed on a code of color, not a secret code, that's the whole point, but a code where the different figures, in especially the gospel stories, would be identified by color, so that anybody could walk up to them, or even illiterate people for that matter, and be able to know who the different characters are. Gray hair and gray beard, blue shirt, orange robe, oh, that's Peter. And everybody agrees those are the colors. There's no point in really learning those today because we have captions and that kind of thing, but for a long time it was useful. You just walk up and you would automatically know who the different characters were once you learned what that code was to figure it out. Well, anyway, back to the story. Peter comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, I have a problem, and I have a problem because I did what you told me to do. And Jesus says, oh no, what's up? And Peter says, well, about a year ago, you told me to quit my job. Peter had been a fisherman. You told me to quit my job and to become like your full-time disciple. And so I did, but now it's come time for me to pay my taxes, and I don't have any money. I don't have money to pay my taxes. What am I going to do? And Jesus says, oh no, you do have a problem. Well, I'll bet you, Jesus says, that if you go back to work for one day, you'll make enough money in one day to pay all your taxes for a whole year. So that's what Peter does. He goes back to fishing for one day. Now the story moves over to the left-hand side of the painting. Over here is Peter again. You see the gray hair and the gray beard, the blue shirt. He's laid aside the orange robe because it kind of gets in the way of fishing. Peter goes back to work for one day. All day long he fishes, but he only catches one fish. This sounds like one of my fishing trips. All day long he fishes. He only catches one fish. And he says, well, it sounds like a pretty nutty idea anyway. I might as well get whatever money I can for it. And so he dresses the fish. And while he's gutting the fish, he notices something. That right before he had caught the fish, somebody had gone down to the lake and taken a gold coin and thrown it out in the middle of the lake. Now, who does such a thing? I don't know. I don't go around throwing gold coins in the middle of lakes. And that gold coin hits the water and starts falling through the water, tumbling like a spinner on a fishing lure. And the stupid fish comes swimming by and says, shiny thing, shiny thing, shiny thing. Eats the gold coin and goes, nah, not a good shiny thing. But right then Peter throws in his fishing line with the fish hook and the worm, and the fish swims by and says, wormy thing, wormy thing, wormy thing. Eats the worm. Fish hook catches. Peter pulls the fish out of the water, and when he guts up the fish, he looks in the fish's guts, and that's weird. He pulls out a gold coin, and guess what? It's just enough money to pay his taxes for the whole year. Who saw that coming? Now Peter goes and pays his taxes. Now the painting moves to the story moves to the right-hand side of the painting. There you see Peter again, gray hair, gray beard, blue shirt, orange robe, and he's paying money to the tax collector. This was a patronage piece paid for by the Medici family right when the Medici family was getting ready to raise the taxes on the people in Florence. So there's a political point to the painting as well. Well, there's a lot of things going on in the painting to draw your attention to. For one thing, we'd say the painting exhibits a technique called modeling. Modeling simply means that the artist has studied human anatomy. The artist has, in other words, studied models, has hired people to stand in certain postures and to study how the muscles and tendons and veins of the arms and legs look, how the body looks when the body is standing at different positions. For example, if we look at the tax collector in the center part of the story, the man with just the orange shirt on, his back turned towards us, he's standing with the weight of the body on one foot and the other foot kicked out a little bit. If we had a more detailed picture here, we could see the tendons and veins and arteries and the muscles looking different in those two different legs because they're in different postures. If we look at the face of Peter in the center of the painting, notice the bags under the eyes, the wrinkled brow, the brow above the eyebrow, the curls of the ear. I know that's not an inner ear, but you know what I mean, inside the ear. The larynx and the veins in the neck, the tendons in the neck. That the artist has studied the human body, studied human anatomy. That particular posture that the tax collector is standing in fact, that he's standing in on the right-hand side of the painting as well, and in several parts, the several characters standing on in that posture is also significant. We would say that this person is standing at what's called contrapposto. Contrapposto is a fancy word, but as you're fast learning in this course, all the fancy words mean something simple. Contrapposto simply means standing with the weight of the body on one foot. Standing with the weight of the body on one foot or one leg. Now, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that is that it's difficult. It's difficult to draw or paint or sculpt the body when the body is standing on with the weight of the body on one leg. It throws out the hip line, the line across the top of the shoulders, all those different changes that have to be accounted for. It's difficult, it's challenging, because you're not just drawing one side of a person and the mirror image of the other side, but the two halves are different because the body's standing with the weight of the body on one leg. There's a slope across the shoulders and the hips, and accounting for all those differences is a challenge. It's difficult. Something else going on in the painting is that the shadows work. We saw some paintings last week where the shadows didn't quite work. But here the shadows line up with each other. They look like real shadows. They're about the length you would expect shadows to be early in the morning when the story starts off. And when you see this painting in Florence, the painting is much larger than what we have in the textbook, or even much, much larger than what you see on the screen. The entire painting is about the size of the back wall in this room. If you turn around for just a second, look back there, it's much larger than even the projection on the screen. And when you are in that room and you're looking at the painting up there, it's about that high on the wall. Over here on this wall, there's a window. That window looks across the street onto a big white marble building that had been built a couple of decades before Masaccio paints this painting. And the sunlight reflects off that building through the window at the same angle all day long and all year long, because it's reflected light, right? The sun's moving around all over the place, but the light's reflecting off the building. And as you stand looking at the painting, the light from the window comes in, strikes your body, casts a shadow that lines up with the shadows in the painting. It's that long and lines up. That's that idea of a window on the world, you see, that you're actually standing there looking on to the scene, that your own body casts a shadow that blends in with the shadows on the screen. Well, for all these reasons and for several others, soon after Masaccio's death, he's given a title and called the first great painter, or the first master. He's called a master because he's mastered so many of these different techniques. The last time we were together, I mentioned Giotto to you, the founder of modern painting. Here we have another of these honorary titles of the first great painter, the first master, because he's mastered so many of these techniques. Across the spread on page 61 in your textbooks, you have another big name for the early Renaissance, Sandro Botticelli, and you see Botticelli's name in the caption of either figure 10.9 or 10.10. 10.9, figure 10.9 on page 61 you have on the screen. Botticelli's La Primavera, the springtime. Botticelli is one of those figures in the course, and there are several of them, that when we come across them, we have to... I just have a chance to introduce Botticelli to you, and some other figures as well. Just have a chance to introduce them to you. My pen is messing up. There we go. What you don't see on these online presentations is me cussing at the cursor business. I call it a cusser because that's what it makes me do. Cursor is just that's how northern people call it, a cursor. I call it a cusser. Anyway, Botticelli here. He's one of these figures that if I gave you a full introduction to the entire painting, we'd be here until the middle of the afternoon. And I don't think it'd be a very good stewardship of our time. It'd be interesting, okay, but in terms of class time, I don't think it's a good use of our time. But I did want to introduce you to Botticelli, at least, as a big name in the early Renaissance. Botticelli is probably most famous for taking symbols from different religious traditions, symbols from Roman religion, Greek religion, Judaism, Christianity, and blending them together into pretty complex allegories. You remember that word allegory from the allegory of the cave. It's a story or a painting that is about something else. And just like the allegory of the cave didn't make a lot of sense as a story, this painting doesn't make a lot of sense as a painting. If you were walking through an orange grove down around Orlando and you turned the corner and saw this going on, you might be taken aback. It doesn't quite make a lot of sense. But it's an allegory. It's not really supposed to. It gets us thinking about something else. I just want to point out the different religious traditions that are demonstrated in the painting here. Let's start over here with this figure over here. This is Mercury, a figure from Roman mythology. Mercury is the messenger of the gods. You can always tell who Mercury is in a painting or a sculpture, although it's difficult to see in both the textbook and on the screen for that matter. But we do have a nice print of this painting hanging down the hallway where it's very clear to see. You can always tell who Mercury is because he has wings on his boots. He's the messenger of the god. He has to run really fast, so he has feet that fly. And if you see a figure with wings on his boots, then you know you're looking at a depiction of Mercury. Mercury is using a stick there to hold back the storm clouds. If I show you a detail here, there we go. You may be able to make that out. He's holding a stick there and using that stick to keep the storm clouds from coming in on this nice spring day. Over here, we have a story that comes out of Greek mythology. It would take us maybe 20 minutes just to tell this story. But it's a story that comes out of Greek mythology. Over here we have a Zephyr, the blue guy here, a spirit that lives in the wind. Here is a nymph, a spirit that lives in the woods. This woman here is the Greek goddess Flora, the Roman goddess of the springtime. Flora, that's where we get the word flower and floral and florist from, or at least the words are related to each other, maybe I should say. You see the flowers on her dress. Again, it would take us quite a bit of time just to tell this story, but it's a story that comes out of Greek mythology. Up here we see Cupid. You know who Cupid is. He's a figure from Roman mythology as well. He's that guy who floats around shooting arrows at people and making them fall in love with each other. If you look carefully, you'll see that Cupid is blindfolded. You've heard the expression before that love is blind, and now you see that depicted for you visually there. Sometimes I think that might be the way things are. Like maybe there's a blindfolded guy who goes around shooting arrows at people, because otherwise I can't figure out how some people end up with some people. But now if there's a blindfolded guy shooting arrows at people, see, that would explain the phenomena. That's what theories are supposed to do, explain the phenomena. That would explain things. That would make a lot of sense. That would start. I had to think about that, but I think that might make some sense. He is, over here, we have a symbol not out of Greek or Roman religion, but a symbol out of Christianity. Although a symbol you don't see very often anymore. The three Christian graces. Faith, hope, and charity, although charity is just a Latin word that means love. Faith, hope, and love. As faith, in this eternal circular dance, as faith leads to more hope, hope leads to more faith, faith leads to more love, love leads to more hope. As these three Christian graces of faith, hope, and love blend into each other, spin around each other. Well, the rest of the painting would start getting us involved in unraveling the allegory, and we would be here for quite a while doing it. I'm not saying it wouldn't be fun, I'm just saying it wouldn't be a good use of our time. Who have we left out here? The woman in the middle. Who is that woman? Well, that's one of the questions that's raised by the allegory. Is that woman pregnant? That's one of the questions which is being asked by the allegory. The allegory is about new life. As I mentioned at the start of class, is a common theme in the early Renaissance. Is that woman pregnant or not? That's one of the questions to puzzle through in the allegory. The space behind her through the trees looks like space through the trees, but it also suggests wings, especially being so close to Cupid. With Cupid's wings there, the idea of new life taking flight. You actually read the allegory by paying attention to the flowers at the bottom of the painting, moving from one flower to the next, from left to right across the painting. You have to recognize that flower and then think through all those stories out of Greek and Roman mythology and figure out which one mentions that flower, and then think about the theme of that story and see how it relates to the next theme. And like I say, it's a pretty complex allegory. If you're interested, you can find interpretations of the paintings online and take a look at them, but I don't think it would be good use of class time to go much further. But I certainly want you to be aware of Botticelli, be introduced to him. A fascinating artist. It'd be fun to do that, but I don't think it would be good use of our time. Also in your textbook, figure 1010, you have Botticelli's most famous individual painting, The Birth of Venus. It's an allegory about the encounter of Christianity with other world religions. Again, it would take us some time to unravel it. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense as a painting, but it's not really supposed to. It gets us thinking about that encounter of Christianity with other religions from around the world. But it shows up quite often in magazine article illustrations and TV commercials and Monty Python skits and all kinds of places. So when you see it, I want you to at least know something about it, okay? That's one of Botticelli's works. And, well, if you're interested, you can find interpretations of the paintings online fairly easily. And if you can't, let me know, and I'll point you to some good sources of information. If you turn the page just once to page 63 in your textbook, figure 1014 on page 63, another big name for the early Renaissance, Jan van Eyck. And Van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage, or Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, figure 1014 on page 63. If you have a good eye for things, you might pick up that we're looking at different colors here than we're used to. Van Eyck is one of the first to experiment with a new type of paint for us to talk about, and that is oil paint, paint that's based in olive oil. We've talked about two different types of paint so far. Last week we talked about tempera paint, that paint that's based in egg yolk. Fresco paint, paint that's based in wet plaster. And now a third type of paint for us, oil paint, paint that's based in olive oil. The chemist can explain why olive oil makes these colors look a little brighter, more vivid, darker, brighter at the same time. All kinds of adjectives we can use here, but they're different than the more washed out colors that are typical of frescoes and that yellowish tinge of the tempera. The colors are just different. If you think about it, olive oil is a liquid. It absorbs pigment. It dries hard. And when it dries, it's in fact exactly the same color it is when it's wet. It makes a very good base for a paint. Maybe a good place to start here looking at Van Eyck's work is with the symbolism in the painting, because Van Eyck makes a heavy use of symbolism in his work. And here's a good place just to make this point to you. What I'm giving you in the lectures, as we talk about different paintings and sculptures and whatever, is the standard understanding of the work. What historians and scholars have done after hundreds of years of examining letters and diary entries from the artists, comments from the artist's friends about comments the artist has made about the painting or the sculpture or whatever and all that kind of thing. I'm giving you the standard understanding of the paintings. Like with everything else in life, you can always find somebody with a different opinion. That's why God created the internet, right? So you can go on the internet and log in and say something and pretend like the entire world now knows what your opinion is about something. You can find all kinds of opinions about some things. Different opinions, some of them kind of nutty, some of them, well, maybe might make sense. If you're interested in other understandings of the paintings, trust me, you can find thousands of them. Okay, some of them kind of nutty, some of them, well, maybe make sense. But if you are interested, you have to know what the standard understanding is anyway. Okay, so I'm just giving you the standard understanding drawn from information about the artist, what the artist writes about the painting, and those kinds of things. Well, let's start unraveling some of the symbolism in the painting. At the top of the painting, you see a chandelier, but a chandelier with only one candle in it. Typically, for the time of the Renaissance, when you have a candle holder or a chandelier with only one candle in it, typically that's a symbol of the Holy Spirit, the presence of God at the sacred ceremony, as the bride and groom exchange their vows, or as you'll see in a minute, rehearsing exchanging their vows. A reminder of the sacredness of the promises these two people are making to each other. The couple have removed their shoes and set them aside. And don't even ask. I can't explain the shoes. They're pretty funky shoes. I have no idea. But that's a reference to one of the Moses stories. At one point, Moses is told to remove his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. It's another reminder of the sacredness of these promises to each other. The little terrier guy down at the bottom of the painting actually shows up quite often in paintings from the Renaissance to symbolize and signify the good things we think about when we think about dogs: loyalty, companionship, watchfulness, courage sometimes, the kind of positive values. To the side on the windowsill and the cabinet there, you see some oranges. Oranges are typically taken as symbols of wealth in the Renaissance. Oranges may not symbolize wealth to you, but that's because you live in Florida in the 21st century. 600, 700 years ago, without those 600-700 years of genetic engineering through breeding and different fruit stocks and so on, oranges in the 1400s ripened very quickly. That meant they rotted very quickly once they were harvested. And so you had to pour a lot of money into labor costs very quickly to harvest the oranges, and then transportation costs. You had to carry them very fast, or else they'd rot and turn to mush very quickly. And so there's a lot of cost involved in oranges that we don't have today. And but a very valuable source of vitamin C, element which is lacking from a lot of Northern European diets in particular. And so a very valuable product, much more valuable than we think of today. There are other symbols in the painting as well, several of them. I mean, Van Eyck portrays the couple getting married in their bedroom. What's up with that? How long is the reception going to be? I mean, come on, people. One thing we can take as a symbol, maybe not in the way we've been talking about it, but the bride's gown here might strike us as unusual, but it's actually the fashion of Italy in the 1400s for the bride's gown to be padded in the front so that it looks like she's pregnant. It's an idea whose application here might strike us as unusual, but it's an idea which itself isn't so odd. It's the idea that if you dress up like something, you will become something. It's not that odd an idea. Excuse me. It's not. Excuse me. It's not that odd an idea. If I dress up like a cool person, I will become a cool person. If I dress up like a successful business person, I'll become a successful business person. It's that idea of dressing up like something and then you'll become something. Okay? If you act like something, then you eventually grow into the role. And it's expressing hope for children for this couple in the future. Like I said, there's several other symbols in the painting. Van Eyck typically makes a heavy use of symbolism. The most famous part of the painting, although I don't think the most interesting part, is the mirror on the back wall. You have a mirror on the back wall that reflects backwards into the room in that kind of funky frame there. There are different scenes from the Gospels in the frame there. That mirror reflects backwards into the room. It's kind of like a space warp in the painting. You're looking into the room that way until your eyes meet the mirror, and then all of a sudden you're looking backwards into the room. Just like if you see a mirror in a real room, you're looking backwards into the room behind you. So as we look at the mirror over here, can you see that red dot moving? Okay. Over here we're looking into the covered bed there, but we are looking into the bed. We're looking into the bed that way. It's over there in the room. Over here we have a window, but that window is not this window. That window in the mirror is over there in the room, so you're looking backwards into the room. Up above, we see the chandelier here. Over here, we see the green gown of the bride, the reddish-brown gown of the groom. Standing in the middle, here is a man, not whom we might expect to see. We might expect to see a minister there with a prayer book administering the vows of the couple. But instead, it's a man who's wearing a blue jacket and a blue hat. He has an easel set up and some paintbrushes, and he's painting a picture. It is a self-portrait of Van Eyck. He sneaks it into the mirror back there. He figures if I was actually there in the room painting the portrait, that's where I would be. I'd be reflecting the mirror. So he sneaks himself into the mirror. Now, this doesn't offend the couple at all. In fact, they get a kick out of it because the artist here, Van Eyck, is a family friend. He and Giovanni Arnolfini are close friends. In fact, Van Eyck's going to be the best man at the wedding, which explains what I think is the more interesting part of the painting and the more thought-provoking part of the painting. And that's what's written above the mirror. You see it there in your textbook photograph. Very simply, it's a very short legal statement. It says, Jan van Eyck was here, his signature, and then a date. Now, what makes that interesting? What makes that interesting is that marriage is a contract. You may not have thought of marriage as a contract before, but that's how it's considered in the law. In fact, you may at some point have heard someone refer to marriage as the marriage covenant, using that word covenant, that old-fashioned word for a contract. The marriage covenant is the marriage contract. You've been to a wedding before. You know what happens at a wedding. Whoever's in charge stands up, and the two people getting married stand there, and whoever's in charge says to one person, do you promise to do this, 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 and this? I do. Turn to the second person. Do you promise to do this, 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 and this? I do. Well, that exchange of promises is a contract. And different contracts are given different levels of importance in the law. Some contracts are so important that they aren't considered valid unless there's a witness statement. Someone who's outside the party, outside the business deal, an independent party who says, look, I got nothing to do with the business deal. I make no money off of it. But if I need to, I can go into court and raise my hand and say, yeah, I was there. I saw both these people make their promises to each other. I was a witness to them making this contract. Some contracts are so important to society that they require two witness statements. Two independent parties who will say, I was there, I saw this take place. If I need to, I can go into court and say, they were both there, there was no duress or violence or anything. They both agreed to whatever deal they made. And, well, Western culture has always seen marriage as one of those contracts which is so valuable to society that it's not considered valid without two independent witnesses who say, I was there, I saw this arrangement take place. And traditionally, it's the best man or the maid of honor who signed the witness statements. Maybe you've done that for somebody on a marriage certificate and say, I was there, I saw these people make their promises to each other. And then, just so you know, the job of being best man or maid of honor isn't over when the tuxedos go back to the rental store, but they're supposed to create an environment and encourage the couple to keep their promises to each other. And when the couple run into problems, then the best man, the maid of honor, is supposed to step in and say, we were there, we saw you make these promises, and encourage the couple, keep with it, keep working through your problems. Anyway, that's a part that oftentimes gets forgotten sometime around when the pictures are being taken. Anyway, that's what I think is thought-provoking and interesting about the painting here, because this witness statement is part of the marriage in a legal sense, because it's one of the witness statements that makes the marriage recognized by society. And so what you have is an interesting wedding gift, kind of a unique wedding gift, because you have a portrait of the couple in the most intimate part of their home, their bedroom, with all kinds of different symbols to give them things to think about as they walk past the painting, to remind them of things in their marriage. And then the painting itself becomes a part of the marriage in the legal sense, that it provides one of those witness statements that makes the marriage recognized by society. And so you have kind of a unique wedding gift. You can spot Van Eyck paintings very quickly. The first clue is oil paint, because he's one of the first to experiment with oil, with olive oil as a base for paint. The other is with the hands. There we go, the very thin, long fingers and hands. Those same long, thin fingers and hands which show up in Van Eyck's Annunciation on page 64, figure 1015 on page 64. You have Van Eyck's Annunciation. We saw an Annunciation scene last week. Here we have the angel showing up, telling Mary. We see Mary there in the dark blue color we associate with Mary in traditional Western painting. The angel says, you're going to become pregnant and give birth to the Christ child. If you look carefully, you'll see a beam of sunlight coming through a stained glass window. I hope that kind of rings a bell with you. You thought I made all that up, didn't you? And there you see a beam of sunlight coming through that stained glass window. And if you look carefully, you'll see... next slide. There we go. You'll see a dove, a symbol of the Holy Spirit in Christian symbology, kind of surfing down that beam of sunlight to Mary there. But if you look carefully, you'll also see those long fingers and long, thin hands, those same long, thin fingers and hands that we see in Van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage. And so that's your clue that you're looking at Van Eyck's work. If you go back and turn to the page with me, to page 62, figures 1011, 1012, and 1013. There we go. We have three statues by a man named Donatello. Donatello, a big name for sculpture in the early Renaissance. We have three sculptures. You have figure 1011 in your textbook, and to the left there, Donatello's St. George. In the middle on the screen, you see Donatello's David, and on the right-hand side on the screen, you see Donatello's Magdalene, St. Mary Magdalene. Three different sculptures, three different materials. You have St. George carved in marble, Donatello's David cast in bronze, and Donatello's Magdalene carved in wood. Three completely different methods of sculpting. To sculpt a sculpture in marble, like St. George there to the left-hand side, you take a big, start with a block of rock, you have a big heavy hammer, a big heavy chisel, and you knock pieces off the stone until you have the image that you want. To cast a sculpture in metal, like Donatello's David cast in bronze, you actually start with two lumps of wet clay. You press the image that you want in the wet clay back. You press the image of the front of the sculpture that you want into one lump of clay. You press the back of the sculpture that you want into the other half of wet clay. You put them together to make a mold. Then you heat up your metal, your iron, steel, bronze, whatever, until it melts, until it turns liquid. Very, very hot. Red hot. And then you pour it into the mold, and then you let it cool. And that's actually a tricky part, because it has to cool very slowly or it'll crack and fall apart. And so very slowly, maybe over a week or even a week and a half, to bring down the temperature to room temperature. And then you take a hammer, you break the mold. You've heard that phrase before. You break the clay off the mold. And then hopefully you have left behind a uncracked whole sculpture. To carve a sculpture in wood, like Donatello's Magdalene there, you start off with saws to get down to the rough shape, but then very quickly transition to very sharp knives to carve the wood away from the image that you want. Three completely different methods of sculpting, but as you see, Donatello is a master of all three of them. The two to draw your attention to primarily, Donatello's David, figure 1012. Historically, it's significant in that it's the first freestanding sculpture since the fall of Rome. Freestanding, that means that it balances. It doesn't have to be bolted to the floor like St. George's there with hidden supports. It doesn't have to be made leaning up against a wall, but it balances. It might not strike you as a big deal, but nobody had made a balancing sculpture in this part of the world in more than 1,000 years. And so, well, it is kind of a big deal. Nobody had even tried to make one, really. But Donatello takes on that challenge, and if we look at the height of the sculpture compared to the base of the sculpture, well, it is quite an accomplishment, really. And the other, Donatello's Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, a figure from the Gospels, one of Jesus' disciples, and that group of 70 disciples. According to tradition, although not according to the Gospels, but according to tradition, she's a prostitute who meets Jesus, gets cleaned up off the streets and all that kind of thing. And here you see her in her wretched condition. There's a famous story about this sculpture that if you're interested, you can go online, go to Wikipedia and read about it if it catches your attention. But a very famous sculpture, and I want you to identify it with Donatello. So Donatello, a big name for sculpture in the early Renaissance. The biggest name to talk about that comes out of the early Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci. If you go to page 66, you'll see some work by Leonardo da Vinci on the screen. I have a self-portrait by da Vinci for you to look at while I talk about him a little bit. He's an interesting character. And before we go any further, humor me. Because I've been in this business for a while. If I don't do something right now, I know what's going to happen. So just play along with me, because I know what's going to happen if I don't make a big deal about it. Here's the big deal. Humor me. Leonardo da Vinci and Leonardo da Vinci, it's all the same guy. His name is Leonardo da Vinci. Sometimes he's called Leonardo. Sometimes he's called Da Vinci. And sometimes he's called Leonardo da Vinci. Now I know most of you grasp that intuitively. But I'm telling you, if I don't make a big deal about it, I know what's going to happen. I'll be coming down the hallway for the third midterm exam. And there'll be a welcoming committee right outside the door of at least two people in a panic. And the source of their panic is going to be My notes say Leonardo painted the Last Supper, and her notes say Da Vinci painted the Last Supper. Which one's right? I'll have to explain, same guy. So if I don't make a big deal about it, trust me, I know what's going to happen. You know what's really weird and eerie about that? Is that those two people who don't get Leonardo da Vinci's name always, invariably, always sit next to each other. I don't know why that is. Like maybe some people have an I don't get Leonardo da Vinci's name magnet in their head. And they show up for class and they don't quite know where to sit, and then that magnet kicks in and they walk right over and sit right next to the other person in the class who doesn't get Leonardo da Vinci's name. Trust me, if I don't make a big deal about it, I know what's going to happen. But he is an interesting character. Da Vinci is almost always held up as traditionally held up as the best example of a concept called a Renaissance man, or a person of the Renaissance. If you hear someone described as a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman, or someone who has the spirit of the Renaissance, that's a reference to somebody who does a lot of different things, and does a lot of different things very well. Because everybody does lots of different things. Not everybody does a lot of different things very well. At one point, Leonardo applies for a job with the Medici family. He sends in a resume. That resume is still around. It's in the Laurentian Library. That's the big library in Florence. You can go and read Leonardo da Vinci's handwritten resume. On that resume, he lists his professional qualifications. He says, I'm an artillery officer. He lists those cities which have hired him in times of warfare. He says, I'm a civil engineer. He lists cities which have hired him to design bridges for them in particular. Leonardo liked the challenge of bridge design. He says, I'm a medical doctor. I've been trained as a physician. He describes himself as a chemist, by which he probably means what you and I would call a pharmacist, someone who mixes medicine together. He says, I'm a diplomat. He lists different cities which have hired him to negotiate trade agreements and peace treaties and things. He says, I'm a musician. He lists different orchestras which have hired him to compose music for them to perform. And about 11th or 12th on his list of pretty impressive things, he says, by the way, I'm also a painter. And he lists different patronage contests that he's won and those kinds of things. Although that's usually what we think of when we think of Leonardo da Vinci first. It's like 11th or 12th on his list of things that I can do and am very well professionally qualified to do. Sometimes Da Vinci is called an inventor, although that's not quite accurate because he hardly ever builds things he gets ideas for. In your textbook on page 1023, you have a page from Da Vinci's journals. Excuse me. According to the story, he always has one of these little leather notebooks tucked away in a pouch on his belt. And whenever he gets an idea for something, he sits down, takes out the notebook, and writes his ideas down. The handwriting might look strange to you because, well, first of all, it's cursive Latin. But he also trains himself to write backwards. Sometimes that's called a code. It's really not much of a code. You just have to hold it up to a mirror to read it. But the idea is he's a very private person. He doesn't like people looking over his shoulder and reading what he's writing. And so he trains himself to write backwards so that somebody walking by and looking over can't see it. In your textbook, page 1023, you have a page from a day when he's thinking about flying. How could you make a machine that would fly? That's his idea for today. In the middle of that page, you see Da Vinci's idea for a helicopter. Some 400 years before anybody tried to make one. And if you know how helicopters work, he's got the idea. You get in that thing, you spin that thing around, and you take off, go flying through the sky. If you understand how helicopters work, you would also realize that pretty quickly he'd find out he needs either a tail rotor or a counter rotor. He's going to get awfully dizzy flying through the sky. But he's got the basic idea. And that's how a helicopter works. But he never bothers trying to build one of these things because he doesn't have something that he needs. And that is power. Not political power this time, but physical power. He needs a power plant, an engine. And without an internal combustion engine, which is first of all strong enough and light enough to build one of these things, you can't even try. You can't get on one of these things with a donkey and a carrot and a stick and go flying through the sky. You've got to have a powerful but lightweight engine. You can't do it with the steam engine. You have to have something light and powerful. So he never bothers trying to build one of these things. At the top of that page, you see Da Vinci's idea for a UFO. It's a jet engine. You build a big metal thing. You get inside it, you suck in air from one end, you heat it up really, really, really hot, you shoot it at the other end. Yeah, that's a jet engine. That's how a jet engine works. But you can't do that sitting in your UFO roasting hot dogs over a campfire. You have to have something burning really, really, really hot to move that much weight. And before petroleum distillates and jet fuel and that kind of thing, well, there's no point in even trying to make one of these things. But on that page, you've got the basic idea for a helicopter, the basic idea for a jet engine, some 400 years in one sense and 450 years in another before anybody tried to build one. Some other pages from his journals. Here we see his interest in anatomy as a medical doctor, his interest in the horse. Here he's interested in new life, that theme that's so common in the early Renaissance. Here, of course, we have a child in the womb. We have some mold spores germinating up here. We have some seeds germinating down here. And back and forth, Da Vinci is going back and forth. What do these things have in common? What is life? What does, when we say new life, how do these three things relate to each other and so on? But what comes to mind usually for people is Da Vinci's skill as a painter. On the screen in figure 1022 in your textbooks, you see Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Arguably the most famous painting in Western culture, today at least. Although not really all that interesting as a painting, not much to say about it. What makes the Mona Lisa famous is all the mystique and the mystery, the detective stories of the Mona Lisa, how the Mona Lisa was painted and then lost, and then found again and then lost in the mail, and then stolen and then recovered. And it's the on-again, off-again disappearing act of the Mona Lisa which has made it famous. It was last stolen about 100 years ago. I want to say 1912, but don't quote me on that. It's about 100 years ago. Disappeared for 5 or 6 years and then was recovered. And the big detective search for the Mona Lisa is what's given it its common, even 100 years later, the mystique and the mystery about the painting. Otherwise, not all that much to say about it, but you certainly want to know that Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. He also paints arguably the second most famous painting in Western culture, which you also have in your textbook at figure 1024, Leonardo's Last Supper. It's a very heavily damaged painting, damaged right from the beginning. Da Vinci tried a different technique where he tried to insert tempera paint into plaster. He tried to combine tempera and fresco technique, and it didn't work. The paint began to flake out of the plaster even during Leonardo's own lifetime. He visited the painting about 10 years after he finished it, and when he saw it, he was embarrassed. And he said, you might as well paint over it, just paint white over it and start all over again because it doesn't look like anything like I left it. Terribly embarrassed that his technique didn't work. You can see whole areas where the plaster has disappeared, or the paint has disappeared out of the plaster. You could make an interesting documentary film about all the different damage that's damaged intentionally by Napoleon soldiers in the 1800s, damaged unintentionally by an air raid in World War II. All kind of damage has been done. But for the most part, it's been preserved and protected because there's some interesting things going on in the painting. One thing that's definitely not going on in the painting, sorry if you're a big Da Vinci Code fan, but this is not Mary Magdalene, this is the Apostle John, or the disciple John at this point. That's the coloring for John. Hate to break it to you. When the Da Vinci Code came out as a book and then a movie, I got a lot of questions from people in town and students, what I thought about it, and I said, well, it's fiction. Right on the cover it says fiction. It's made up. Not even very well, I don't think, but it's made up. But what about that part that says it's a true story? That's the part that's made up. Some people have a problem with that one too. But they love the book because it's about this guy named these two guys named Leonardo and Da Vinci and their adventures and stuff. Anyway, one thing going on in the painting which is kind of interesting, that over and over again our eye is drawn to Jesus. Jesus is set off from the disciples here in the middle. He's just said, one of you is going to betray me, so we have anger and questioning and confusion. The 12 disciples are grouped into 4 groups of 3. Jesus is there by himself. Most of the direction is directed towards Jesus. He's framed in the back doorway. But there's another way that Leonardo directs our attention to Jesus. It just has to do with the way the eye and the brain are wired to each other. But if the eye sees a line, like I'm trying to draw across the top of the tapestry here, not very well, it tends to follow that line until it gets to something interesting. So many of these lines in the painting all guide the eye down to the same point. It's not exactly where I'm ending there, but it's close enough. You can take a piece of paper and kind of circle around the painting and see all the different lines in the painting that guide the eye down to Jesus. Over and over again, as your eye travels around the painting, the eye sees a line, like the line across the tapestry here, and will follow the eye back down to Jesus. Over and over again, you notice something over here, and then you keep coming back to Jesus. That's a little psychological trick we're going to see a couple of times in the course. A way of an artist getting inside your subconscious mind and telling you where to look. We're going to see that several times. Well, Leonardo da Vinci, the best place to close up the early Renaissance, the big name for the early Renaissance, and someone to know something about.